you. I think we also have to think with our audience now. So I would like to open up. Yeah, please, go ahead.
Well, thank you very much for this very enlightening talk. And I do believe, first, sharing your passion with the public is a great thing. But one thing remains a little puzzling for me. You keep talking about, all four of you, about collecting and exhibiting as if that is the only role and duty of a museum. We have guardianship, cultural, political agendas. We have educational purposes, not only universities. Inclusive things. Like New York galleries don't like to see blind people or hearing impaired people going through their spaces. It doesn't look good. But a public museum fulfills a role that is far more inclusive, socially speaking, than a private museum has to be, because it follows, your private initiative, which is beneficial in a different sense. But I'm a little surprised that we're focusing so much on collecting, exhibiting, and who has his hands first on good art or bad art. But that's not the only role a museum has to fulfill, from my perspective, at least.
You're absolutely right, but I think when we are talking about private and public museums, we are not talking about these other duties of the museums. We just wanted to compare this competition between the private and the public ones, because, of course, all museums have a really big educational department nowadays. We are really inclusive. We do special things for dement persons, for disabled persons who are blind or deaf, and therefore, but these are very small groups of our society. And because I'm deaf or because I'm blind, I'm not an art enthusiast. So just 1% of our society is interested in fine arts, and also 1%, I would say, of the handicapped persons are interested in fine arts. And therefore, the people who come for the special purposes to the public museums are really very, very few. We offer with lots of impact and lots of money. We do offer so many programs, but for very few people who finally use these programs, and therefore we come back to money and politics. So how much we spend, how much money we spend for these things for how many people.
But I think, if I understood correctly, it was also a plea sort of for a look at the quality of the kind of education that's being offered. So rather than sort of what politics often do, look at the numbers, it is important to have spaces that offer education, that offer services that that are not offered at other places at all. So even if it is only a handful of people, it might be very important sort of for those.
I agree, but we can't run these programs without money, and we get the money only if we have a certain number of people.
Yes.
And this is how the circle is.
Yeah, that's a vicious circle. Bitte.
When I read the title, A Global Power of Private Museums, I thought about my trip in the summer. And I thought about museums I had seen as a student. For example, I was ringing at the door of the Villa L.I.S.A, and Panzer di Biomo showed us his collection a long, long time ago. And when you go to those places and you see how people show their Soluits, Naumans, California light spaces, whatever, it's such a sensation you couldn't get in museums during that time. And a little bit away from Varese, close to Laga Orta, you can see a wonderful private collection by Calderara. Calderara had a huge network with artists, and such a collection you don't see in museums. So you really have to go to private museums to get the full scope. And you really have to dig in, and that's the possibility you have when you go to private places where one person decides what he collects. And to follow that vision is a great, great opportunity. And because if you go to a public museum, there are several directors with different with a different focus. So in the end, for sure there are gaps, and nobody has a guy like Philip Johnson around who gives all the things he buys to the Museum of Modern Art. And whenever you want something, Alfred Barr said, Philip, buy it from me. And that's a good solution for sure. But so to get the full picture for everybody who's interested in art, whether he is a practicing artist or an art historian, whatever, you have to go to the private museums too. And global power, that's a very new expression for right now. We read about it a lot. It's a big topic in the news, but the small places are still very important, and you have to know about it, and then you get the full picture.
Yeah, thank you for this insisting on the individuality of private museum places. Yeah, please.
I wanted to come back to the question of engaging the audience. And I was wondering whether you could talk a little bit more about the use of technology and what the challenges and opportunities are to engage a broader audience, maybe also understand your own audience better and expand the audience, as I said.
Of course, this is a big challenge for all museums, and there we have really a huge challenge because digitalization means lots of money. In the 1990s, when France and England and the United States started to digitalize all their works of art, I always want to remind people that the German museums had big other problems to cope. They made the reunification of the GDR and the BRD, and they didn't dismiss any museum staff in these days, and they doubled the number of museums, and therefore in the 1990s no money was spent for digitalization in Germany. And in these decade in the National Gallery in London, they had hundreds of people just scanning all the works of art, photographing, and we are really back in that point. And now everybody says, oh, digitalization, we should do that. Yeah, make your vision for digitalization. But we have no money. Sorry, it starts, we have not even the technology for speed internet in our museums, but we should be digitalized better yesterday than tomorrow.
It's also maybe the question what you do with it, right? I would say sometimes less is more. It depends on what you want from a museum. If you want to sit in front of too many screens, then I wonder, it depends. I mean, interactive, all that is fine, but I think the museum space is also a demanding space because it asks for this interaction, right? It asks for you need to do some sort of effort when you go to the museum and walk around in the museum. And when there's too much technology, for example, I recently revisited again the Cairo Museum, which I love, and I advise you all to go because they're going to move to a new, up to the, a state-of-the-art museum next to the pyramids. And the old museum is a museum that belongs into a museum where, where you can almost like touch everything you want. And I mean, it's not to that extent, but it makes walking around in the museum, it's a very different experience. So it depends, I think, also on the kind of experience we want and the kind of interaction we want to have with objects, right? And if we want this to be mediated to such an extent by technology. This said, I think we can do a lot, especially, in the digital humanities with also manuscripts and so on. It's amazing what can be done also in the exhibition space. Think about There were exhibitions in Dublin of James Joyce manuscripts, which were amazing. So I agree we can do a lot in the exhibition space with technology, but I also think always this, like we are running behind and we have to catch up, I feel is problematic, sorry.
I think in a museum of fine arts, you will never replace the feeling of the original by screens and things like that. But to digitalize our works of art is the base to communicate with the scientific world. And you don't need a university museum to make really deep research on your collection. And for that, it's a really important step that all the public museums have to go.
Sorry, I'm not just talking about using technology in the exhibition space. It's also, once you've got your objects digitized, for example, it's about engaging audiences that are not physically in the space where the museum or the gallery or the private museum is, and thereby attracting maybe new visitors that wouldn't have come otherwise.
Yeah, I think it's a very important move, and I guess it again leads us to the question what we consider the public sphere. And the museum is one of those places where the public sphere has been created and is played out, is remade, and not by chance it has a very important role where museums are located. And if they interact with the communities around the spaces up there in the middle of the city, if they are in other communities, and I think we can think of spaces that are much more inclusive, and we have to understand that our public sphere now is changing dramatically, and if we don't go into the internet, I think the whole thing is lost, even if the visit as such is important and can't be substituted by the digital means. But I absolutely agree, if we don't engage in this digital sphere, I'm sure it's done. So, but the idea of being inclusive is so important, I think, here.
Yeah, thank you. I think. Sorry.
Maybe just one thing, because I'm totally different. So the people who come to our space, they want to have a guided tour by myself, and I'm happy if they have a glimpse in their eyes in the end, and that's it. You can't bring that through the internet or something else. So this is another strong point for the private museums. As you said, you visited the place and you feel the surrounding, and it's a special place. Yeah. So this is why I don't do anything.
But
so
I guess you also have to know about the original. And I think this is a fascinating question, because it would be interesting to know, if we talk about sort of the individual approaches of the private museums, I would find it very interesting to know whether this also means that some of them employ different digital strategies. For example, in European museums, it's always said that the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam is one sort of the best institutions, and I absolutely love their website, and I spent hours on it, and actually I don't have an answer to that, but it would be very interesting to know whether there's also a kind of branching out with private museums in different digital strategies. Thank you.
As an art historian, I think that digitization is really, we need that for two things. We need it for research. It will facilitate research because I cannot be everywhere. It simply makes things accessible. And we need it for education. It's a tool of spreading information. But as the director of a small private museum, I think that I'm completely with Mr. Haubrok and with the gentleman who just said what he said about Panzer di Buomo. There is no substitute for seeing the work itself and living it, experiencing it. And there is something to be said of enthusiasm that can be conveyed by somebody like Mr. Haubrok or like myself when I give the tour in my collection and in my museum. Then people say, oh my God, I didn't think contemporary art could be so interesting. And, I did that once with an audio guide, but I didn't really have the connection, And now you've shown this thing to me, and I will be back. You know, and that's very, very nice. But then, of course, as a marketing tool, and that's what you said about strategies for digitization, as a marketing tool, that's also very important for private museums. How do we get people in? So social media, for example, are really important in that sense too, you know, which are not as important for me as an art historian, as a research tool, but still, you know.
Thank you.
I would like to argue that there's no such thing as a private museum. I think it's a case of Etikettenschwindel, of mislabeling. The museum is a public concept, and the museum, at least in a modern sense, is a trinity of research, education, and display, and that's what characterizes it. There's private collections, and the collection means that, as you keep emphasizing, there's persons who have their own taste, their own engagement, their own passion, and that's what makes the collection. It makes it possibly idiosyncratic, maybe. Maybe people will laugh about it 20 years later, but that's what makes it special, and that's what you're talking about. So why confuse the two? Why not be proud of it? Why not be proud of saying this is a private collection and possibly at some point it will enter a museum? And not confuse it and aspire to something that you don't even want to aspire to.
No. No, and actually, Axel Haubrok was sort of insisting on the fact that he doesn't consider himself a museum. Although I would say there are places, I mean, with sort of museums with a big building built around and so forth, just call them collections would not sort of describe sort of what they think of themselves.
But on the other hand, if you have a museum, I think the museum shows are shows which can be, lots of them can be shown in a Kunsthalle or somewhere else or in a gallery. Yeah. So this is changing as well. I don't think that the museum shows always have the high quality of their collection, because they have to fulfill the expectations of new things and everything. And if you look at what Udo Kittelmann or whoever does during a year, this is not the work of a museum, this is the work of a Kunsthalle, I think. Yeah. And I never talked of myself having a museum. In my first statement, I said maybe it's something like a Kunstverein or like a Kunsthalle. You're totally right. You're totally right. But on the other hand, the role of the museum is extended to attract people with new things which nobody knows whether it's of value or not. Sorry.
I'm actually obliged to ask a very provocative question, a historical question. And it's to some extent inspired by what Baader was referring to, the roots of the museum, colonial roots, national roots of the museum, but there's also older roots, namely the Kunstkammer, the curiosity cabinets in the past. And to some extent, in the history of museums in Europe, the birth of the museum was the making public, or the nationalization, as it were, of the curiosity cabinets of kings and princes, their collections, etc., and making them national property and indeed educational institutions. But fast forwarding to now, last week there was this the UBS PricewaterhouseCoopers report on billionaires. What do they do? They invest in art. They collect art and establish museums. So my provocative question is, are we returning to a past that we had left behind for a couple of 100 years? So are private museums today the Kunstkammer of the new kings and the new princes?
I think it's a good way of describing a certain set of circumstances. Yeah, I think there is something about it, which on one side is very fine. I still make the distinction between the statal and the public, right? And I think there is a distinction between a museum run by the state and a museum like Frida Baader or whatever that is by a collector and is, that makes a difference. It's not the same, and we know very much how much they can very often keep. The right to rearrange the collection, show certain pieces. They even keep objects in their personal possession and only give the building. We didn't speak about architecture until now, but architecture in this whole thing is so important. It makes the museum what we expect of it, and you addressed it at the very beginning of your first statement when you spoke about Hollein and how this attracted the people, and then again, we come into urbanism and the role of the space that the museum is creating in a certain community. So, yes.
Yeah, thank you. I think the sort of the notion of the refeudalization of the art world is important to bring up here. You have had your hand up for a long time.
Thank you very much. We've had a few discussions about the actual definition of museums, I guess, and we haven't really come to an agreement, I imagine. The other interesting word in your title is power, and I wonder what you really mean by that. Are we talking about money? Are we talking about influence? Are we talking about cultural capital? And so really understanding that, I think your views on that would be quite interesting. And the other second question I have is that, you know, you've talked, I think there was a sort of feeling that there's a lot of museums, but is there? When you look at the public, that, you know, if you look at the percentage of the public that actually go to museum, it's very limited. And perhaps in that way, this sort of these private museums or whatever you like to call them is a way of attracting more people. If you think that art is a very important thing. So, 2 questions.
Well, I guess the question of the power also goes to me as a conveyor, and I think you brought up different notions of power. One is sort of connected to capital, the other one is connected to cultural capital, sort of the question of defining the canon, and I think we wanted this title to include all that, and we will talk about through that during the next days. So I'm afraid I cannot sort of define the power sort of with just one thing. I think if we have a global network, and we should also talk about the network actually also, of private museums, it comes with a lot of money, it comes with cultural capital, it comes sometimes with an ambition to redefine the canon, sometimes not, and I think sort of that's what the conference is for, to talk through that. I think although sometimes we get the impression that there are very many museums, maybe there are too many museums in some parts of the world, you also spoke to the problem that although we have so many museums, that it doesn't mean that the majority of the population goes there. And that's sort of talking about the audiences will also something that we should keep in mind for the next days.
I just wanted to come shortly back to the notion of quality. I was a little bit surprised that quality played such a big role in the discussion, and I was thankful for some of the remarks that were already made to it. But just a short question about it. So I'm talking about quality of the artworks. It was about the collection and the artworks. It's the private museum better or the public museum? And my question would be: is this discussion about quality and the notion of quality, isn't that part of the problem and not part of the solution of this discussion? It's not very. I don't think the question is very clear. It's just a.
Which problem?
Yeah, the problem that this may be connected to the word power in your title. So what do private collections and what do private museums do in the world? And what are the motivations and the incentives of private collectors? I think this has very, very little to do with quality of artworks, even though every private collector would of course always say it has to do with quality. But I'm not sure if it really does.
I think the museum has the necessity to keep the mind of the population for many, many years, to have a big canon and do other things. And a museum doesn't have the money to buy this work from today, or it is impossible. So we have to decide who's taking care of what. And I think like a Kunstverein, like a Kunsthalle, like a private museum like we have, there are other, I know of course, but we are testing out what is interesting, what isn't interesting, what is the quality in some years. And you have a private collection, we spend private money to buy work, and in the end, maybe we were wrong. I think this is okay. We are a private collector. I know the collection of the Federal Republic of Germany, where there's a group of curators. I think they change every 2 or 3 years or something like that. If you look at this collection, it is awful, because it's the personal view on works for one period. Like Veit Lörs bought something totally else from anybody else. And so, as a private collector, and if you collect for 30 years or so, you have your own line. And this is what you see in the end. And I think this is the important thing. And whether this is quality or not, I don't know. This history will show. But I think museums should take care of their core business, like education and keeping the things and preserving and all this. I think right now the museums are doing a different job just to attract people, as you saw. I do understand. And You're right. And I know this. I think this is the problem.
So that's a plea for a division of labor.
I have a good solution, because a museum which stops collecting is not a museum anymore, because collecting is one of our 4 columns. And we are preserving, we are doing research, and we doing education, but we are doing also collecting. So, but I have a solution, because I absolutely agree with you. So, the private collectors are collecting, and in 50 years or in 80 years, the museum directors are going to choose the best works from the private collectors and will bring them to the public museums, and then it is like it was in the past in a way, because only the really good things, which was proven as the good things, came to the public museums. And I think it's wrong that museums of contemporary art spread up, and the museums directors got the challenge to say, okay, I have to decide now what's worth in our canon. And as you say, most they're wrong.
It's not a case of trial and error.
So
clearly, it's my personal.
I agree.
And it's trial and error.
Yeah, that's true.
I would like to come back what you said about getting the full picture, because I think this is part of the quality of a collection. This is what a collection offers, right? A private collection often offers. And I think maybe I know museums have done some work in that respect, but I always feel frustrated when I go to museums, because I feel I do not get the full picture. I do not get this magic circle. I do not have like the personal relationship. When was this acquired by whom? All this history, which is closely linked to research, right? So I think that is maybe also a challenge, especially for Western museums, because it comes with colonial conquest and so on, right? So providing the full picture also of the collection history, of the trajectories of objects, right, into this collection, into private collections, and then possibly into a public museum. So I think that very much speaks to the quality of an object, the kind of, if you want, information, context that comes with it. As regards capital, I also wanted to say something. Certainly in the Gulf, financial and cultural capital come together, and this is, I think, why it's so attractive. There's also tourism, but there's also certainly nation building, right? And wanting to play a leading role representing all kind of modern and contemporary Arab art and competing also with Western museums that do that. And I think, in a way, I mean, modern art has by definition been Western art, and now this is being challenged, but I think this also explains, partly, to some extent, why we have such an overdose, if you want, of modern and contemporary art museums here, because we here want to play a leading role in the modern art world, right? And once we have these museums, we claim ownership, right? And a lot of that is also happening in the Gulf. And, I mean, they have so much more money than, the big public museums across Europe. So they attract a lot of artists who go there. And not only artists, I mean, everything that comes with a field of art. So critics, university professors, students, whoever wants to make some money or a living, many go there.
I have a question from one of our participants, speakers, lecturers.
Thank you. So actually the point I wanted to raise has just come up right now, and this is the very special link between the many private museums spurring in the last few years and the concept of the contemporary. And I think, of course, there are exceptions to this, but I think in the mind of most people, most private museums are connected to the concept of contemporary art. And there is a special allure to contemporary art, or to put it more simply, contemporary art is hot and people like it. And just as they go to the biennales and the art fairs, they like to go to see museums of contemporary art. And that connects also to concepts that were raised here, to the question of canon creating, power, etc. So you might want to comment on that, because there's a special kind of idea that maybe is not so much connected in the eyes of the public to public museums and is more connected to private museums.
Yeah, I think, for example, the Museum of Modern Art in Buenos Aires, which is a private foundation, MALBA, is precisely a museum that will tell you a different story of modernism with a lot of money invested to show this collection in a very precise way and showing the importance of Latin American art and its impact on the history of modernism. And that's a private initiative completely. And they collect contemporary art, but they collect the whole 20th century and will tell you, like a mirror of the MoMA, a history of modernism in Latin America. And therefore, and this is just one of many examples. I could go to Cotonou and think of Marie-Cécile Zanzou, who founded a museum on art in Benin and West Africa, and she will tell you a history in her museum of contemporary and early and modern art in Cotonou and West Africa. So there is, and that relates to the question of power. So is there a power to change the canon? That's one question. Is there a power that, again, relates to the market and creates certain transnational names? But I also have to say that there are many private museums that collect non-contemporary art. But also, let's say, for example, in Mexico, we have lots of people who collect so-called pre-Columbian art. So it is not only about the contemporary, even if that's the main field, but it's also about how to write a history of a specific place and a nation. And that's terribly important. Therefore, I would argue, so the question of power is at stake. What power do they have to retell stories? And as if we spoke about the Gulf, just to say, it's not only that the painting by Leonardo was sold last week, the Abu Dhabi Louvre was opened, and this is a story about mankind in 12 chapters, I think, where there is a whole history of universal values told in the new display. And you might know that at the opening there were, I think, 4 women accepted in the opening, and they just came 4 days later. So I think the global power of private museums is very much there, and how they create audiences. And power is extremely involved here. And quality... yes, I mean, it's important. So, absolutely.
It's more a comment rather than a question, because people have been dismantling the title of the conference, and I would like to pick up on the word markets, which I felt has been neglected, because I presume very few people come from this part of the world, from the trade. And there is evidently a very strong connection between the people who sit in the auction rooms and buy the artworks and buy from the major galleries, and the people who buy the best piece of land, commission the best architect to build the most kind of, outrageous, private museums. And those people, they buy, some people. I mean, I would like to differentiate. Obviously, most collectors have a very, very profound, I would say, agenda, but it's not always the case, because the trends that you see in how people buy in auction houses and in art fairs and stuff, it has to do with trends within this group of people, what they collect. And you can actually visit certain private museums or, say in Miami, for instance, in certain years, and you can see that certain artists that know A-class contemporary art museum would show in an exhibition, they are displayed there. And they get attention which might be, in perspective of art history, far beyond what they should get. And this agenda is basically, the cultural agenda is being kidnapped in that way. Those people are the people who can pay curators, in a way, as you mentioned, that public museum cannot. They can offer them research funds like nobody else, and they have them serving their own agenda. And as they buy art for tens and hundreds of millions of dollars, they need to protect this asset. So there is an ongoing kind of cycle there, where the main problem in that is not the question even if museums should show contemporary art or not. Museums cannot afford to show, or they only can afford blockbuster exhibitions. That's the way they can deal with that, but otherwise they cannot have them. It's not possible. They can't afford it. It's just in perspective, when Frieze, the art fair, is happening in London, Tate has a fund, which is about, 500, I think. It changes a bit, but around £500,000. And this is in terms of how contemporary art goes. It's very little money. But they have to do with that. At the same time, people come in and buy for tens of millions. Yeah. And put it in their private kind of, exhibition spaces.
Thanks for bringing this up again. I think these are sort of the dark and the bright side of redefining the canon. You have just brought up that there are private museums you said in Argentina? Sort of, and you would say, thank God that this history of modernism isn't only told by the Museum of Modern Art and whatever, the Lehnbach House, but is sort of also seen from a different perspective, and that's awfully needed. But then on the other hand, it's also sort of, the canon is being redefined with money by collectors that have the money to sort of fund the entire infrastructure and research structure, and then place people there that might not be of sort of any public value. So I guess we have to look at both phenomena. Yeah, thank you. I thank everybody for being here. I thank all of you for your patience, for your listening, for your contributions. I thank my panel so much. I thank Axel Haubrok, Baader, Sonja, Mejcher-Atassi, and Christiane Lange. I thank Dorothee Wimmer again, and I thank Benedict Savoie, and I thank the TU for having us here.